So I'm just going to leave you with a few final thoughts to conclude this module on the aircraft stall spin. Firstly, it's interesting to point out that given the considerable design differences between those early aircraft, think back at some of those photographs of those early biplanes from the 1920s that we saw, and compare them to the modern equivalent. It's interesting to point out that features of the spin are very similar to how they are for modern aircraft. So we've seen that almost every documented spin analysed in this review here had a spin frequency of somewhere between 0.3 and 0.7 Hertz, an angle of attack, depending on whether it was a flat spin or a normal spin, of somewhere between 25 and 70 degrees, and a spin radius of somewhere in the region of 1 to 3 meters. So it's interesting that these huge differences in design of aircraft from the 1920s to the present day, 100 years of aviation difference, characteristics of the spin are remarkably similar still to this day. Despite the radical improvements in design of aircraft to improve the aircraft's predictability and controllability during a spin, we still see that there are a number of key parameters, such as the pitch rate that we saw earlier on, which continue to oscillate throughout during the fully developed stage of the spin. It's also interesting to point out that with the availability of modern high-tech equipment, which is available off the shelf, can provide a higher degree of accuracy for these type of airborne studies than ever before. And as the development of technology improves and matures, and all of this instrumentation gets further and further miniaturized, obviously we can achieve much more robust data than ever before. But it's interesting again to point out that although nowadays we can achieve better accuracy than ever before, the more modern and up-to-date spin tests only seem to validate these fundamental qualitative results of the 1920s, rather than go ahead and discredit or disprove these early findings. So it's really only testament to these early pioneers of the field, many of whom risked their lives in these early days for the advancement of knowledge in this field. So it's testament to their ingenuity, their perseverance, and how they were able to achieve so much given their limited resources. And finally then, as spin research continues, it continues to impact the wider context of aviation. So of course all of these spin studies have been fed back into aircraft design for performance, efficiency, and above all safety. All of those design criteria owe in some part to these flight test studies to investigate the spin. And of course the predecessor to a spin is of course a stalled flight. So of course the aerodynamic theory for high angle of attack flight and stall conditions has also been accelerated as a result of these flight tests of spinning. Something else to point out as well is that the way in which experimental research is conducted today compared to how it was in those early days of those pioneers of the aviation. So of course today flight tests are heavily shrouded in safety, and as well they should be, but it's apparent from conducting this review of these articles that safety and cost were not necessarily a priority for these early pioneers of the field. So I'm going to leave you with a few sentences from the obituary of Lieutenant Wilfred Park, who, as we discussed in the introduction to this module, was the person attributed with the very first demonstration and recovery from an aircraft spin, which he performed in 1913. And as I mentioned, he unfortunately died at the age of 23 later that year on the 15th of December. So this screenshot of this obituary was taken from the Aeronautical Journal, published in January of the following year. And just think about whether in 1913 the readers of the Aeronautical Journal would think that we would still be talking about Park's legacy and his impact in aviation almost 108 years later. So the Aeronautical goes on to say that Park was generally recognised as being one of the most experienced of our naval aviators, as well as one of the best flyers. That he should have met his death in such a simple accident is one of those curious vagaries of fate, such as may be the lot of any man. One knows of men who have hunted for years, being killed through their horses falling on an ordinary road. And there in the photograph you can see Lieutenant Park there on the far right, in the long black jacket with his hands in his pockets, obviously still a young man at that stage.